Hey, today we're going to start talking about an interesting topic in not only New Testament circles, but also just in the wider discussion on Christian theology. And this is going to be about the death of Jesus. Now, the reason I like chapter 5 and chapter 6 is they both do a really good job at trying to get at an issue that is probably often overlooked in just the wider Christian discussion, trying to ask the question, why did Jesus die? Both of these authors agree that the death of Jesus is vastly significant, but they are trying to look at why was Jesus killed. The common statement that many people in the West make today is that God sent Jesus to die for our sins. And both of these scholars are going to look into that and try to ask the question, well, what does that mean? Why was Jesus killed? Maybe there's more to it than we commonly think. So the essential question that we're asking in chapter 5 and chapter 6 surround the question of the death of Jesus. So in chapter 5, and again, this is Marcus Borg, please make sure that you are aware of that. Here's his essential question. He's asking it right at the very beginning. Why was Jesus killed? Now, in this chapter, he doesn't come out and state his thesis right at the very beginning. In fact, his thesis is kind of on his last paper. Because oftentimes in argument, you'll see the argument kind of unfold to its final climax. And that's really what he's doing here. So you're going to have to read the entire chapter to get to his thesis. But his method is going to be really straightforward. He's going to be addressing the question, why was Jesus killed? Now, you'll need to really and thoughtfully read over this first little bit because here he's saying that, the prologue, Jesus' death and his own purpose. So let's go back to chapter 4, I believe. Does Marcus Borg think that Jesus thought of himself as the Christian Messiah or as the Jewish Messiah? So think about that. I hope you said no. I hope you said that Marcus Borg does not think that Jesus thought of himself as the Christian Messiah. Now, we can rephrase the question. Does Marcus Borg think that Jesus was the Christian Messiah? Absolutely. But you can see how those are two totally different questions. So he says here, for centuries, Christians have seen the death of Jesus as the very purpose of his life. It was salvific. That is, it had saving significance and makes our salvation possible. He's saying for centuries, this is what Christians really thought, that the purpose of Jesus' life was death. And Marcus Borg is going to ask the question, is that really the case? Is that really how Jesus saw it that way? Did Jesus see his own life as, the purpose of his life was death? So notice here, but did Jesus see his own purpose this way? According to the present, or the Gospels in the present form, yes. So here, read over this carefully. He talks about the Gospel of Mark. He talks about the Gospel of Luke. And he says, given all of this, it is not surprising that the death of Jesus has been seen as the purpose of his life. But was this how Jesus saw it? Was a salvific understanding of Jesus' death in the mind of Jesus himself? Or was this a post-Easter product of the early Christian community? Now, if you have understood Marcus Borg well so far, I think you know where he's going with this. Think about this. If Jesus did not think of himself as the Jewish Messiah, as he argues, is Jesus going to think that his death is going to be salvific? Well, the answer is going to be no. Jesus does not, for Marcus Borg, believe that his death is the purpose of his life. So he does not believe that his death is going to be salvific. So he poses his question here. Was it salvific in the mind of Jesus himself, or was it a post-Easter product of the early Christian community? So notice what he says here. He says, Tom chooses the first and I choose the second. He says, N.T. Wright sees Jesus' death as central to his messianic vocation and purpose. Jesus not only knew his life would end in crucifixion, but he also saw it as the climactic kingdom action that would defeat the powers of evil and bring about the real return from exile. You'll read that in chapter 6, and he does a really good job of articulating what N.T. Wright says. But he goes on and says, but I, Marcus Borg, am skeptical that we can trace any salvific understanding of Jesus, or of understanding of his death, back to himself. He says, rather, and this is getting to his thesis, by the way, I think it was the early Christian community after Easter that first interpreted it so. Okay, so now here, you go back to Marcus Borg and remember the pre-Easter and the post-Easter, the history remembered and history metaphorized. So I hope you are understanding the question. Did Jesus see his own death as the means that God would bring about salvation? Well, for Marcus Borg, again, the answer is no. So he says this for several reasons. He says first, and again, anytime I see first, second, third, I highlight those and I make sure that I understand what he's saying there. He says first, with a majority of mainline scholars, I see the passion predictions in Mark as post-Easter creations. When you read the Gospel of Mark, you will recognize that there are several times where Jesus predicts his death. And Marcus Borg is asking the question, did Jesus do that? Or was that written into the text from the later Christian writers? And you already know his answer is going to be the latter. So second, he says, for reasons I will soon explain, I see the use of passages from the Hebrew Bible generally as prophecy historicized rather than as prediction fulfilled. He's going to spend a few paragraphs unpacking what he means there by prophecy historicized. And then third, he says, I have trouble imagining that Jesus saw his own death as salvific. He's correct here. He says N.T. Wright and himself differ substantially on this topic. They very much do. But read over this. I hope, because he does a good job of unpacking his argument, what his big concerns are. The notion of one's death as having an atoning effect for others was present in the Jewish milieu of or in which Jesus lived and died. So he goes on to say that he said, or that I accept that it was possible for a first century Jew to think this, but I have difficulty affirming that Jesus believed this about himself. Okay, I hope that this is helping make sense of this a little bit. So here he's really getting to the heart of the issue. He says, I find it not only a strange notion, but an unattractive notion to attribute this idea to Jesus. In other words, he really finds the ideas that N.T. Wright is proposing, that Jesus will see his death as central to his life, is a bit unattractive for Marcus Borg. He says, I don't want Jesus to have seen his own death as having the significance Tom gives it. As a Christian, I want Jesus to be an attractive figure. So, and Marcus Borg unpacks this elsewhere. You can see that footnote there. He talks about this in other books. But he sees the idea of the centrality of the death, in other words, the death as the climax, as a bit unattractive. And so he's going to try to unpack who Jesus was, what he did, why he was significant in other ways. So down here, he says, in short, I could accept that Jesus saw his own death, this is the way that Tom suggested, only if there were very strong historical evidence for it. I find it more historically persuasive and religiously compelling to see the purposeful understanding of Jesus' death as post-Easter interpretations and as history metaphorized rather than history remembered. This is just kind of adding on to the layers that he's been discussing so far. This really is nothing horribly new. So at the end of this first section, my claim that Jesus did not see his death this way does not mean that I think that Jesus' death took him by surprise. Okay, get that. Just because Marcus Borg does not think that Jesus thought his death was going to be the climax of his life, does not mean that his death took him by surprise. He says, in all likelihood, I think that he realized that if he kept doing what he was doing, he risked execution. Yeah, get that. I personally think that Martin Luther King Jr. knew if he kept doing what he was doing, he risked being killed. There are several people throughout history that they lived a life with such a trajectory that they realized if they kept going down that road, it might inevitably lead to their death. He said he knew what happened to his mentor, John the Baptizer. He may well have known that his journey to Jerusalem would end in his death. But this is a very, very different from saying that Jesus saw his own death as central to his purpose. Now, if you haven't read the Mark's final account of the Passion narratives, passion is another word for death, you really might want to pause the video and go read those last 4 or 5 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. Mark is only 16 chapters long, so maybe start yeah, excuse me, about chapter 10, 11, and then you can go through the end. So what he's going to do now is he's going to talk about a summary of Mark's narrative. I'm going to let you tackle this. This is really straightforward, but I want to unpack a really main point here. He says, above all, Jesus was in conflict. If you read that last week of his life, or the last couple weeks of his life, he was really in conflict with, as Marcus Borg says, the temple. He would go into the temple and he would teach and he would preach, and there would be a lot of questions from the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were basically kind of some of the leaders of the temple. So he says he was in conflict with the temple. Near the beginning of the week, of the last week of Jesus' life, he performed what has been called his most dramatic public act. He overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple courts. Understood by scholars in a variety of ways, the action seems to have been a prophetic act, like the symbolic acts performed by the social prophets in the Hebrew Bible. As such, it was a protest against the temple's role in the domination system, and perhaps warning of divine judgment against it. Now remember, he's talking about in chapter 4 the domination system, and how the domination system was not only the Romans, but it was also the Jewish elite. It was the leaders of the temple. Now, it was these two major groups that were coming together. And so he's saying here that Jesus was in conflict with the temple because of their participation and their perpetuation of the domination system. So he says the temple is also subject to the text of Mark's final account. Jesus told a parable directed against the temple authorities. They were like the wicked tenants of the vineyard, who kept all of the produce of the vineyard for themselves. So here, he's really identifying Jesus' final work in his last week of his life as a condemnation of the temple's participation in the domination system. So he concludes this section. I find Mark's account of Jesus' life historically plausible. He thinks that this is oftentimes probably pretty good history remembered. Now he's going to talk about the final 24 hours of his life, and he's going to talk about four new terms, or three new terms, one you already know, and you need to take notes on these, you need to jot them down, you need to know what he means by this. So the first one is really simple, history remembered. He thinks that some of the final week of Jesus' life, as reported in the Gospels, is history remembered. It happened. Now, he already, again, some of the events in the Passion stories really happened. That one's pretty straightforward, you know that. Prophecy historicized. Now, the Hebrew Bible is frequently quoted or echoed in the stories of Jesus' death. In the Gospel of Mark, yes, even more so in the Gospel of Matthew. And so the question that he's going to ask is, what are we to make of these correspondence between the Jewish scriptures and the Passion stories? In other words, do they appear because they are prophecy fulfilled, or because they are prophecy historicized? Let me give you the two, or let me talk about, or read this, and then I'll give you the examples. He says, that is, do these correspondences appear in the text because the events surrounding the death of Jesus fulfilled prophetic passages in the Hebrew Bible? Okay, that's question number one. Or, and you already know kind of what he's going to say here, or did early Christians create details in the Passion stories from the passages in the Hebrew Bible, doing what he calls forming prophecy historicized? So let me try to unpack this slightly differently. Several times in the Hebrew Bible, there are predictions, and you would have talked about this in your Old Testament class, known as the suffering servant, the servant songs. There are several, there are about three or four in the book of Isaiah, actually. So the question is, were those actually pointing to Jesus in some point in the future? And therefore, when Jesus showed up, that he is fulfilling those prophecies, and they are, let me see if I can find it here, what he would call prophecy fulfilled. That's option number one. Or did Jesus live his life in such a way, and the early Christian community understood him in such a way, that when they were living, or when they were writing the Gospels, they looked back into the Old Testament, into the Hebrew Bible, and they formed what he calls prophecy historicized. So did Jesus do these things because they were prophecy fulfilled, or did the early Christian community read back on those as prophecy historicized? Just think about that. What is he going to say? Is this a product of the pre-Easter Jesus, or is this rather a product of the post-Easter Christian community? And you already know he's going to choose the post-Easter Christian community. So read over these. And here he uses the example of Psalm 22, which begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me? It begins as a psalm of lament. And then it continues into a psalm of praise and a psalm of joy. But the question he's trying to ask is, did Jesus actually read or quote, not read, quote Psalm 22 when he was on the cross? Or did the early Christian community put those words into the mouth of Jesus when he was up there? Okay, so really unpack that. Make sure you understand what he means there. So the third term you need to understand here is imaginative elaboration. Some parts of the Passion stories are what he calls imaginative creations. These include the details that wouldn't have been known, as well as scenes created for apologetic reasons. He brings up a couple of things here. When Jesus was having a discussion with Pontius Pilate, who was present? Okay, don't say no one. Well, Jesus was present and Pilate was present. And yet, whenever we read the Gospels, we have a pretty lengthy discourse of that conversation between Jesus and Pilate. When Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, his disciples, the Gospels report, were off and they were actually sleeping. And yet we still have the words of Jesus. So Marcus Borg is going to ask the question, are those words actually the words of Christ himself, or are they what he calls imaginative elaboration, where the authors of the Gospels, again, the post-Easter Christian community, they are elaborating on this narrative to really unpack the metaphorical truth and significance of Jesus, of who he was and why he was significant. So imaginative elaboration, again, is the elaborative discourse that we have in the Gospels for Marcus Borg that nobody would have been present to actually know what was said. And then the final thing, purpose of interpretation. The interpretation of Jesus' death as serving a divine providential purpose is found in all of the Gospels. His death was necessary, foreordained, and predicted. It was supposed to happen this way. But this perspective, he says, you already know what he's going to say here, right? This perspective is most likely a post-Easter retrospective interpretation. I don't think Jesus saw his death as the purpose to his life. So now he's going to ask the question, how much of the final week that we have in the Gospels is historical? So he's going to point to Mark's story because Mark is the earliest, and Mark is going to likely be, according to most scholars, the most historical. So the Last Supper, he says Jesus likely had a final meal with his disciples, with his followers. He is skeptical that Jesus instituted what is known as the words of institution. These are the words that Christians say every time they celebrate Eucharist, where we say on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread. And after giving thanks, he broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Marcus Borg does not think that Jesus actually said those words. So the next thing, the betrayal of Judas. He says, I think it was likely that Jesus was betrayed by one of his followers. Now, what did that really mean? What did it mean to say that Jesus was betrayed? Well, he is going to ask the question, maybe it meant, or what does that mean? Maybe it meant for Marcus Borg that because there were so many more Jews in Jerusalem at the time of Passover, some scholars think upwards of 1 million or more additional Jews down in Jerusalem or at that time of the Passover, that whenever we talk about the betrayal of by Judas, really what he may have been doing is just giving up the location of Jesus, disclosing the location of Jesus to the temple authorities and also to the Romans. So the final thing, the arrest in Gethsemane. He says, I think Jesus was with his followers when he was arrested. And he says, I have no reason to doubt that a garden or a grove known as Gethsemane, which is still there if you ever travel to the Holy Land, on the lower slope of the Mount of Olives. So that stuff, he really says, that stuff was likely historical. Okay, so whenever you are thinking, to yourself, how much does Marcus Borg think is actually history remembered? Well, it's likely those three major things. Now he's going to kind of go to the next side, history metaphorized, or he's going to then revisit imaginative elaboration, purposive interpretation, and prophecy historicized. So, yeah, let me get here. So he does really try to ask the question now. So about the events reported between the arrest and the execution, including the trials before the Jewish and Roman authorities, I have little historical confidence. So what he's saying here is he doesn't really think that after Jesus was arrested, what the Gospels are saying happened, it may not have happened that way according to Marcus Borg. He says, whatever happened was not witnessed by Jesus' followers. They had fled and they were not there. Okay, so go back and think to yourself. If he is saying that nobody was there, his followers weren't there, and yet we have this discourse in the Gospels, then what is that? What do we have there? And remember, he is going to say that this is what is known as, or what he calls, imaginative elaboration. So, Mark tells us that there was an exception. Peter, he said, followed from a distance. But if this were true, he could still not have witnessed what happened after Jesus was taken away. The events were essentially hidden from public view until the crucifixion itself. Now, he's even more uncertain or skeptical that there was a formal trial that Jesus, was tried by the Jewish and Roman authorities. He doesn't think that happened. And again, read over this to understand his rationale there. For additional readings or reasons, he says, I'm skeptical about the story of a Jewish trial. It was against the Jewish law to hold a trial at night, and it is virtually impossible to imagine the high priest and the Sanhedrin convening on the evening or night of Passover. It's almost as if, maybe a modern illusion, like on Christmas morning or on Christmas Eve, it's like a whole bunch of Christian leaders, dropping their, one of their most holy days. Even a better example is Easter. Between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, that is the holiest time in Christianity. So his argument here is that's essentially like a whole bunch of Christian leaders, the Pope, all of the cardinals, all of the priests, the bishops in the Episcopal Church, just dropping what they're doing and having a trial. Like they wouldn't do that, Marcus Borg is really trying to argue. So he's going to finally turn to the crucifixion. So those are the things, we just concluded that section, those are the things that are probably what he's going to call imaginative elaboration. And so now the crucifixion. How? Read over this. This is actually pretty straightforward. Jesus was crucified under Roman authority. He was crucified on a Roman cross. If you have a cross maybe around your neck or maybe in your house, that is a symbol in the modern world of salvation, of love, of forgiveness. But in the Roman world, that was a symbol of terrorism. That was a symbol of Roman execution. And it's interesting how he's going to talk about that here. He said crucifixion was a Roman form of execution. It was commonly used for two categories of people. You need to get this: political rebels and chronically defiant slaves. Now, why? So one more thing. In certain parts of Rome, they would have crosses that would be on both sides of major roadways, particularly in communities that held or that were slave communities, or where there were a high number of political rebels. Now think about that. Why? Why would they publicly execute people on roads? It's a good way to keep the slaves oppressed. If you rise up, this is what's going to happen to you. If you are politically defiant against Rome, this is your fate. This is what's going to happen. And so Jesus was killed by a Roman cross, as a means of Roman execution. And so he's really talking here. Jesus was not a slave, but it follows that he was crucified as a political threat to Roman order. Who was responsible? Well, as already mentioned, he said the form of execution points to Roman responsibility. And yet he says that later on in the Gospels, they turn, it seems, to really blame the Jews more than the Romans. And Marcus Borg is really going to argue that the death of Jesus was more due to, more caused by the Roman side of this rather than the Jewish side. He's going to say the shift, or that early Christian communities shifted the responsibility perhaps to the Jews, and he's going to unpack why that is here. He says a major reason of the shift that Marcus Borg is arguing from Roman responsibility to Jewish responsibility was the political exoneration of early Christianity. He says, imagine yourself as a Christian in the Roman Empire in the first century. The central figure of your movement had been crucified as an enemy of Rome. And how would you defend yourself against the charge of being part of the politically dangerous movement? Well, what he's saying you do, what he's saying the early Christians may have done, is shifted the responsibility from Jesus being defiant against Rome to the Jewish people had, or the Jewish leaders had, a vendetta to really get Jesus. So read over this. He's going to continue here. What else can we say about what lies behind the gospel picture of the responsibility? He says, though details remain vague, nearly all mainline scholars see, and here again he's unpacking his thesis, Jesus' arrest and execution as resulting from a collaboration between the ruling elites of the day, the Roman governor, and a small circle of Jewish temple authorities. Remember, these are the two groups that Marcus Borg calls what? These are the two groups that Marcus Borg calls, remember, the domination system. And he's already unpacked what that really looks like, how the domination system dominates politics, it dominates life, it dominates the way that things are. And if you are not a part of that domination system, you are necessarily oppressed. You are necessarily a victim of that system. So why was Jesus killed? Again, I told you how he's working towards the climax of this chapter. Why was Jesus killed? Now, he's already said, I see the understanding of Jesus' death as salvific, as a post-Easter interpretation generated within the early Christian community, and not as the intention of Jesus himself. Okay, he's already said that, but he hasn't yet come out and said why he thinks Jesus was killed. Read over this, be sure you understand it. He says, according to this scene, Jesus was condemned to death for what looks like to be a Christian confession of faith. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the soon-to-return Son of Man. Early Christian belief about Jesus and expectation of his second coming are combined. As a historical report, it looks suspect to me. So is Marcus Borg saying that this is why Jesus died? No. Get that, please. He's saying, according to this scene, this is why Jesus was killed. But he says, this looks suspect to me. It is more persuasively understood as a post-Easter creation. Thus, he says, my historical judgment about the capital offense of blasphemy is probably not. So here, does Marcus Borg think that Jesus was killed because he committed blasphemy and said that he was the Messiah? No, he does not think that that is why Jesus was killed. If the scene, and again, man, underline this, circle it, make stars, copy it down, do whatever you need to do. If the scene of the Jewish trial does not provide historical reason for Jesus' execution, why then was he killed? For me, he says, the most persuasive answer is his role as a social prophet who challenged the domination system in the name of God. Okay, go back to chapter 4. Remember how he's saying that Jesus was, as a Jewish mystic, was a spirit person, a healer and an exorcist, a wisdom teacher of unconventional wisdom, a social prophet, arguing and fighting for social justice, and a movement initiator. He says, again, the most persuasive answer of why he was killed was his role as a social prophet who challenged the domination system in the name of God. To make the same point somewhat differently, if Jesus had only been a mystic, a healer, and a wisdom teacher, I doubt that he would have been executed. But he was a God-intoxicated voice for religious, social protest who had attracted a following. Again, in my classroom at school, I have a poster of Martin Luther King Jr., and I have a poster of Gandhi, and there are others there. But if somebody is really fighting against a systemic means of domination, they might end up being killed. That's his argument here. I would be interested to read what Marcus Borg would say about Martin Luther King Jr. He was, I think, a social prophet who challenged the domination system in the name of God. So much of Martin Luther King Jr.'s work was to challenge the systemic racism of not only American history, but primarily of America during the Civil Rights Movement. And so this brings up really interesting questions about today. Not only was Martin Luther King Jr. arguing for equality back in the 1960s, the 1950s, the 1940s, but I think that this also extends to you and me. This extends to my relationship with people in the world around me, and then also to you. But he's saying in the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated because he likely challenged the domination system in the name of God, so too Jesus was killed, was executed by the Roman authorities, by the domination system, because he challenged that. He challenged the conventional wisdom that said your status in society was a divine right. It was God-given. He challenged the system that said, the powerful, they should be first. The rich, they should be the ones who rule the world. They should be the ones who get food first, and then everybody else should be on the lower side of society. He challenged that way of life. Again, if you haven't read Hunger Games or seen the movies, read them, watch the movies. That is very similar to what ancient Rome was like. And so Jesus shows up on the scene to challenge the domination system for Marcus Borg. And it is that very challenge as a social prophet who challenged the domination system in the name of God, which ultimately led to his death. And he said, in Jesus' world, this was enough to get arrested and executed by authorities who didn't care much for criticism and who feared popular unrest, as the execution of Jesus' mentor, John the Baptizer, not long before demonstrates. To make the point yet one more way, Jesus died as a martyr, not as a victim. A martyr is killed because he or she stands for something. Jesus was killed because he stood against the kingdoms of this world and for an alternative social vision grounded in the kingdom of God. The domination system killed Jesus as the prophet of the kingdom of God. This is the political meaning of Good Friday. So if you read some of Marcus Borg's other work, or if you read some of the stuff that he writes later on in this book, following Jesus really has a lot of social responsibility. If one is a follower of Jesus, that means that they are too advocates for social justice, for equality. They care deeply and profoundly for the very people that Jesus himself cared for. Jesus died as one who challenged the domination system. And so and read that chapter later on in the book, part of what Marcus Borg says about the Christian life is to live in this very real world politique, this real political, social, economic world that Jesus lived in as well, and to argue for social justice, for equality. He says, of course, the story does not end there. There is Easter, the subject of my next chapter. This has a variety of meanings, but what he wants to have us focus on is this final section here, that Jesus was killed as a victim of the state, or sorry, as a martyr of the state, not as a victim, as a martyr of the state, because of his God-intoxicated social prophecy, that he lived as a leader who was a spirit person, a wisdom teacher, a social prophet, that's a big one, a healer and an exorcist, and a movement initiator. So why was Jesus killed? It's all right here on this last little section. But he unpacks his argument as he writes throughout this. So you need to understand not only the essential question, the thesis, but also the method. How does he go about making this argument?